I'm Joyce Williams, and what we're doing today is doing a video tour of the First Church Unitarian and some of its more historic items that are inside.
And I'm Beverly Cyr, and I will be assisting Joyce as we tour our beloved building. This is the third church building on this site. The site was selected, first of all, in 1730, and in 1742, the church which had a gallery but no bell tower. In 1794, a new church building was built, and later the bell tower. In 1841, this church was built here in a Greek Revival style. It is built on Westford granite and cost $3,217.90.
The bell is actually older than this building. It goes back to 1808. It was taken down in 1903, recast and actually enlarged at that time. The clock is not an original part of the building. It dates back to 1903. It's weight driven. The weights are now lifted by an electric motor. Originally, they had to be pulled up by hand, and the weights themselves descend through the columns in the front of the church. The clock is above the bell, very unusual. It's usually the bell is on top of the clock if you look at various steeples around the area.
The weather vane is a representation of Halley's Comet, which was an event which happened in the end of the 1800s and became a popular artistic motif.
This bench was added in 1996 at the time that Barbara Chapin retired as treasurer, and it was meant to honor all the treasurers that the church has had. This wing was added in 1961 to provide more room for the Sunday school, which had reached an enrollment of 100 students, and classes were being held everywhere, including the kitchen.
And it was built by Henry Whitcomb.
It was built by Henry Whitcomb, right?
And I believe it replaced old stables.
Originally were horse sheds on both sides of the building. The ones on the other side came down in the 1930s. When we first enter the building, this is the room you come into, generally known as the vestibule. In the vestibule are plaques with the Roll of Honor. Two plaques here list members of the church that served in the two world wars. This first one is for the First World War, and then for World War II. The woodwork on this, or I guess the whole thing, was created by William Hood. William Hood was the shop teacher in the Littleton High School, and one of his pupils was Henry Whitcomb. This chandelier is on all the time on a very low wattage. It was given by the Weber family in memory of Horace and Vera Weber. On the portrait is of William Hunt White, who was the fourth town minister. He was the first Unitarian minister. He was the minister when this building was built. This was a chart that was made when the building was first used. It shows the arrangement of pews and who owned them. And these pews were box pews, not the current pews that we have now. And the arrangement of aisles also is different. This chair, although it's probably missing a comb back of some type, was used by Reverend William White while teaching his many Sunday school classes. He is also noted for being the one that first inaugurated the idea of Sunday school classes in this church.
And now I'd like to show you the old minister's study, which is off the main vestibule, Rather tight quarters. It's not used as a minister's study any longer. It's mainly storage. But please join me in our trek upstairs. Some of these plaques show our history through the years. In other words, the way we were. For instance, this is the school pledge. The plaque was in use in 1913. And this office was first used by William H. White. And I imagine that up here in these close quarters, it was very hot in the summer and cold in the winter.
This is the door to the steeple, and it includes, when we get up there, you can see the back side of the organ and other interesting things. About 2000, the steeple was rebuilt. The spire was taken off, sat on the church lawn for about a year. An old chimney that was no longer in use, the top part was taken off, and the bottom part was kept in place and used as the base of a support for the steeple. All right, this is the workings of the organ, which you don't see. It's behind the scenes. Over there are pipes, and here there's a wind chamber. The organ that we have was installed in 1899, long before the building had electricity. So to begin with, air for the organ had to be pumped by mechanical means, and it required someone to stand and work this handle and pump air in it. And the person in the process was known as blowing the organ, which today seems strange, although a mechanical blower for the organ seems perfectly reasonable. But the records always talk about someone who was hired to blow the organ.
And let's now proceed to the next level.
And up here you can see the weights for the clock and all of the machinery that runs it. It's similar to a grandfather clock that you might have in your home. The weights gradually descend and run the clock. They are controlled so that the clock registers the right time. Years ago, the bell was told whenever anyone died, it was told the number of times to match up with the person's age, and that would give people in town a good guess on who it was that had just died. This rope can be used to ring the bell anytime somebody wants to do it, and it's frequently done on Christmas Eve. And here we are underneath the sanctuary in the back cellar. You can see some of the structure and how the building has changed over the centuries. The floor was raised at one point, and one can see the old structure that seems to show where the original floor was. And over here there's some steps which now go nowhere. These steps apparently originally came out in the vestibule. And over here we have the electric bellows for the organ, which was obviously not original equipment, but was added after the building had electricity, and probably not immediately after electricity was put in, but sometime after that. This is a church kitchen, which was redone about a decade ago. The floor was really interesting. Before it was redone, it was simply linoleum over dirt. Now we have a nice hard floor. This is our main function hall. It's been much more usable after the wing was built, because when the wing was built, the furnace was taken out of this room. This is an old grandfather clock that came to the church along with the parsonage as a legacy from Walter Titcomb. The clock itself was made by Windmills and Wegman of London. As grandfather clocks generally are, it's run by weights, a pendulum to regulate the timekeeping, and weights to give it the power. And the weights are pulled up by hand and then gradually descend, creates the power to run the mechanism of the clock. The safe is used not so much for security, but to keep old records, to protect them from fire. And this is, in particular, is one that is kept in here, dates back to 1864. Has old church records in it, and is now used to as a membership book. When people join the church, they sign this book. This is a cabinet that was made by Henry Whitcomb, and the purpose was to store the archives of the church. And various old record books are here, and papers in boxes.
For instance, this is an old checkbook from 1891.
This is a portrait of Edmund Foster. He was the third town minister. It's painted in 1816. It stayed in the Foster family and his descendants until the year 2000, when Edmund Foster Sewell was the last owner, and when he died, the painting was given back to the church. He was a fifth-generation descendant of the original Edmund Foster. After the painting was received, it was restored, and the frame restored, done by the Alliance. And this is a photograph, a portrait of one of our earlier ministers. William Ichabod Nichols was here from 1884 to 1889, and it includes also a photograph of his wife. All right, this cabinet is a mate to the other cabinet that we've looked at, also made by Henry Whitcomb. This one is storing the church silver. Some of the silver was given by Mr. and Mrs. Reuben Hoare, Reuben Hoare being the man for whom the Littleton Library was named. There are two plates. These are communion silver, and there are plates and these big flagons before the time of individual cups for serving communion. Everyone drank out of the communal cup. Some of those old pieces, especially the ones from Reuben Hoare, date back to 1867. All right, this lectern was donated in 1962 in memory of Sidney Randolph Willey, an infant that lived only a few weeks. It was donated by his grandparents, George and Marion Hartwell. It was used in the Sunday school for a number of years when they used to have regular worship service at the beginning of the hour. This is a portrait of Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker was a noted abolitionist, Unitarian minister. He was one of the group that helped fund the raid on Harper's Ferry. When he died, after he died in 1860, his wife gave this portrait to the widow of our minister, William White. It passed down to the daughter, Phoebe White, who was the last of William White's children to survive, the youngest. And in 1922, she gave the portrait to the Alliance, the Women's Alliance in the church. And in 2008, the Women's Alliance paid to have it restored, and it's been hanging in the vestry ever since. This desk was crafted by William Hood in 1963. It was for the minister's study. Right after the Sunday school wing was added to the building, which allowed for the creation of a study for the minister. This 4-volume set on the Encyclopedia of Religion in America is noteworthy because they used an image of our sanctuary quilt on its cover. In 1905, it was decided to redo the front of the sanctuary, and at this time, the Greek revivalist elements were added, the pilasters, the big panel behind the pulpit, and the plaques.
The plaques are now adorned with the symbol of the chalice, but historically, those chalices are covering on the left Psalm 25 from the Bible, and on the right was a saying from the Gospel of John.
The sanctuary quilt was made by the women of the church, was designed by Edith Smith, who was a great quilter. The lowest row represents earth-centered and goddess-centered religions. The second row represents the traditional religions of the West, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic. The row above represents the Asian religions. And the top row, to begin with, represents the humanist. The center is the Unitarian Universalist. And the blank represents the fact that we don't know everything yet. This pulpit is not terribly historic. It only goes back to 1952. It was built to accommodate the Reverend E. Palmer Clark, who was over 6 feet tall. Since then, most people have used a box of some kind behind the pulpit in order to be able to see over the top. Because the pulpit is so high, the platform has been used to help other people see over the top. And the most recent one, which was built in the last year, was made by Hugh Vartanian. The bench behind the pulpit was reportedly built by the Reverend William White, and the story is that it was built in the 1830s for his daughters to sit on, and whether they were actually hard of hearing or didn't listen well, we're not sure, but that is the story that has come down with the bench.
I'd like to show you now the pulpit Bible, which is resting on a lectern. It was presented to the congregation in 1856 by Asa Priest. The lectern itself was given to the church by Joyce and David Williams in memory of their daughter, Priscilla.
The baptismal font was given in 1922 in memory of the 4 girls always together in church and Sunday school. These 4 girls were by then grandmothers. The hymn board also was given in 1922 by Mrs. Fred Hartwell in memory of her husband who had killed in an accident in his sawmill. This is a Steinway grand piano that was given to the church in 2008. Principal donors were Eric and Laura Semple, with some help from other members of the congregation. This is the 3rd grand piano the church has owned, all of them in the second half of the 20th century or later. The windows are very low to the floor here, and this is because of the renovations that were done in 1874 when the floor was raised. Originally, the windows were at a more reasonable height. The plan was to raise the floor of the sanctuary and put a vestry underneath. And the floor was raised in order to provide headroom for the proposed vestry. Various things were done at that time. The pews were replaced. The original box pews were replaced by the ones you see now. There had been a gallery in the back of the church with an organ, and the gallery was removed. There's still a choir loft that's a little higher than the floor of the sanctuary. The organ at that time was lowered, and that was not the current organ, but an earlier organ that belonged to the church from about the time of the Civil War. The organ is a tracker organ. It's a historic organ, and it's a pipe organ, obviously. It was installed in 1899 and replaced an earlier organ. Some of the pipes in the front are simply fake, and others are actually part of the working parts of the organ.
This is a quilt that is called We Are Made of Stories. Members and friends of FCU were encouraged to donate a piece of cloth that was meaningful to them. This also was done at the same time that the sanctuary quilt was done, and supervised again by Edith Smith. Each piece of fabric has a special meaning to the person who donated it. I'd like to draw your attention to a square in the lower left-hand corner, which was donated by Martha Childs in memory of her father, Bill Childs. It is a piece of his bandana, and the brown is a piece from his work glove. Bill spent many years tending to the outside of our building, taking care of the gardens, taking care of the inside of the building. He was formerly a sexton of the building for possibly 20 years. Bill loved this building and the people who are here. This is the notebook in which each and every piece of the quilt is explained. Each church member, each friend of the church had a story to tell with their particular donation of fabric. So this remains a beautiful representation of the individuals who make up this church. The superimposed chalice brings the feeling of the church community together. The many pieces of fabric are stitched together lovingly and represent how we come together as a church community. So that concludes our tour of First Church Unitarian. We hope you've enjoyed hearing the stories and seeing the many interesting things in our building.
We've enjoyed making this video, and we hope you enjoy watching it.